Whatever the order, whatever the case, whatever you choose to think about it, Gamaliel's point is clear. A leader showed up, he got a following, then the leader died, then the following went away, the end. In verse 38, Gamaliel gets to the heart of his point, saying, look, if Jesus was another fraud, just give it a little time and this will go away, just like all the others. But then he demonstrates a rare moment of sobriety and self-awareness when he warns his colleagues that if the thing is from God, there's nothing they can do to stop it. Even though it's only a few sentences long, this is a masterful piece of rhetoric on the part of this Gamaliel fellow. He doesn't ever engage the substantive theological points of Peter's remarks, and in doing so risk exposing the weakness of their own theological position or possibly inflaming the room further. But he also does enough to keep his colleagues from going berserk and engaging in a bloody affair that I'm guessing he didn't want any part of. There's some big picture reasoning that he's employing, and even though he seems very skeptical, he's at least willing to acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, God is doing something here. And he reasons to the point of saying, hey, if God were to do something, we might not notice right off the bat. But maybe by giving it a little bit of time instead of acting rashly, we'd have a chance to get on board a little bit later in the game when we finally did see what was going on. So let's give it time. Maybe I like what he has to say so much because it seems like the guy's wired kind of like me, in that he tends to say, look, unless there's imminent threat, just let stuff play out a little bit. The good stuff will kind of come to the top and the bad stuff will kind of get exposed for what it is. But sometimes if you freak out and mess with stuff, you can mess things up that really weren't messed up in the first place. According to the Eastern Christian tradition, Gamaliel went on to become a follower of Christ and I think is even regarded as a saint or at least someone important in their cosmology of Christian all-stars from the early days. Verse 40 says, his speech persuaded them. They called the apostles in and had them flogged. Then they ordered them not to speak in the name of Jesus and let them go. If you're reading this for the first time, the second half of that verse is probably a little bit of a surprise because it starts by saying his speech persuaded them. Then next it says, so they flogged him. That's weird. Generally, I would think that if you persuaded them not to respond so harshly, then there wouldn't be any kind of flogging at all. If that's what persuaded them looks like, what were they gonna do? So at any rate, they just do a casual flogging, for the safety and benefit of the apostles themselves. They're trying to help them be more spiritual. And then they send them out the door with clear instructions to shut up, which really doesn't sound like they caught what Gamaliel was saying, because if these people shut up, it's going to be hard for truth to out. And it would really require them to keep talking in order for it to play out properly and pass Gamaliel's test of whether or not it's from God. So I don't know, it persuaded them enough not to kill the apostles on the spot. I think that's what Luke is saying in verse 40. Verse 41, the apostles left the Sanhedrin rejoicing because they had been counted worthy of suffering disgrace for the name. For the second verse in a row, I have never been flogged. I mean, just not even a little bit flogged. But I've read about it and I've seen pictures, and I am guessing that if I were to be flogged, rejoicing would not be in the top 20 list of responses that would come to mind while I'm still dripping blood and trying to patch together my hamburger back. These people were really into it. They genuinely believed that they were doing something that mattered more than even their own lives. Maybe as they were walking out of their bleeding, they had in mind what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5. And what's that? I just happen to have just flipped right to it. He said, blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. I'm sure they also had a sense of reciprocation in mind. I mean, these people were alive to watch Jesus' life, to watch what he went through being unjustly executed, to watch him lay down his life for the sins of the world. I bet they came away from that thinking, that's a debt I can never repay. That's a gift I can never return. But now all of a sudden, they're feeling suffering, and that suffering even somewhat emulates the suffering of Christ. And so they're excited that maybe they were able to give something back. I don't sense that Acts is generally an instructive book that is telling us lots of stuff we ought to be doing. And I don't sense that Luke is saying here that everybody for all time is commanded to get beaten from time to time in the name of Jesus. But in this situation, it happened, and it's happened to a lot of people since. And it's happening right now in the world as brutal people are injuring and even killing Christians in the name of basically nothing. And if it does happen, even though it's not easy to endure, passages like this remind us that it's not in vain. The passage wraps up like this. Day after day in the temple courts and from house to house, they never stopped teaching and proclaiming the good news that Jesus is the Christ. So there's your answer to the warning in verse 40. They're going to go ahead and keep talking about this stuff. Flog us all you want. Here are a few very quick, big picture observations that I didn't quite have a chance to hit on as we were going through it. First of all, props to Gamaliel for having some common sense and taking a sane approach to thinking about questions of faith. Does this seem like right now, especially, the tenor of this conversation we're having is really out of control? Have you hung out on Reddit? I love that site. There are great people on that site, but there are also people who just get mad about things for no reason. It's like they're really, really threatened and angry by a God they don't think exists. Maybe it's the luxury of hiding behind a keyboard and a monitor, but people get freak out crazy about conversations about religion on sites like that. You have people on both sides of several debates right now, quick to skip all of the debate and the conversation part and just call each other awful names and disparage and dismiss other people's views, to do so with absolute rage and hatred. And don't think that's just in one direction. That's going hardcore in both directions right now. I mean, you got ISIS. What's going on with those people is insane. The bloodshed, the madness, the disregard for culture and history and other human beings. But for the most part, and unless you look closely at history, you'd never know this, religious people of all different stripes have behaved really very well throughout history. The flare-ups that we encounter are much more the exception than the rule, but understandably, people want to stop and take note and try to learn historical lessons from those moments where people behave very badly in the name of religion. And learning those lessons the hard way is great and all, but I think we focus exclusively on that at the expense of all the lessons that we could be learning from people who did it right throughout the years. Not just people from our own tradition, not just people who think all the same stuff. Gamaliel may or may not, after what's recorded in the Bible, have become a follower of Christ. But as we encounter him here, he's a part of the team of people who sent Jesus to the cross. He's not necessarily an ally. Yet this still is worthy of being appreciated and noted. That's what it looks like to sanely disagree about religion. That's what it looks like to sanely disagree about anything, except the flogging part. That was disappointing. I think a lot of us, including myself, especially when I get worked up, could use to take note of this and employ the kind of level-headedness we see from Gamaliel here when we have conversations today. A second thought, it's just generally wise to be a person who's loyal to evidence. Now, this also is news to a lot of us in the 21st century, but the evidence won't always support our presuppositions. Bear with me. People can be wrong about stuff, and things that we're pretty sure of and have posted on Facebook about with certainty aren't always true or necessarily backed up by evidence. Think about the people you admire and respect the most. I bet there are people who are willing to change their mind when presented with better evidence. I bet there are people who aren't partisan hacks who just agree with whatever people on their side of the aisle say about every single thing. The reason these things are attractive and the reason we like people like that is because they're trustworthy, honest thinkers. And I hope it's what we all aspire to be as well. Whether this guy was a Christian or not, well, I don't know. For our conversation, it doesn't matter at all. What we see is a good example of following the evidence and thinking wisely, reasonably, being patient, and letting the evidence take shape so that one can make an informed decision about where to go next. These are highly admirable qualities that anyone of any faith or lack thereof would do well to emulate. Third and finally, Gamaliel did his job actually very well in the big picture sense. He's a priest, a religious leader. His job was to connect people with their God. In presenting a reasoned roadmap for judging the merits of the claims of Jesus and his disciples, he set up a test that everybody for all of history can consider for themselves. He said, if there's nothing to it, they'll scatter. If there's something to it, it'll last. This is not a universal test for truth, but it's a consideration amongst many considerations to keep in mind when reflecting on whether or not something like this has merit. Again, as we consider whether or not we'll identify as followers of Christ, this is only one of many tests to consider. But it is a test that the claims of Christ and the scriptures pass with absolutely flying colors. So much stuff. Time for an incredibly abrupt ending. I'm Matt Whitman. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour. Thank you.